Okay, hey everybody. So we're live. It's Tuesday, September 9th, 9 o'clock Central Time. If you're out there, drop by, say hello in the chat. Um, so in this video is a little bit of a follow-up to the video that Shane Starr and I did last week, where we talked about the different models and tried to reconcile them to the extent we can, or at least talk about some of the main differences and why those differences might exist. And did a little bit more thinking about it and wanted to sort of just riff off of that and talk about what I think is going on, and maybe a way to sort of reconcile all these different models and different approaches we have out there, and why um, why under different models we might agree on some types, disagree on other types, and why when you see somebody who purports to be an ESTJ, or we all think that this person's an ESTJ, and why other people might think there's something else like an ENTJ or something like that. So and I don't think it just boils down to some people get it and some people don't. Um, I think there's more going on to it than that. And it reminds me of a comment that I think is one of the sort of more interesting comments I've gotten on this channel on one of my videos, and I forget the video, and I forget who even asked it. I apologize if you're out there, and you're the one who asked it. I'd like to give you credit, but I kind of forgot. But anyways, but the person who left the comment asked, if this is such a sort of if personality type or psychological type it has some sort of utility to it, where we as a species have sort of not only that we've sort of diversified into these 16 different personality types for one reason or another. And I think and my whole idea, or it's not just my idea, but the idea that I adhere to is that there's this evolutionary sort of pressure on cultures to be able to survive, and you don't want a culture or a group of people who are all the same personality, because you sort of get this single point of failure type of issue problem, where if everybody's an INFJ, then who's going to wash the dishes, that kind of thing, where you need these different personality types to sort of fill different roles within the culture to sort of have a cohesive whole, right? In the same way that our brains are divided up into different modules that do different things, different personality types sort of perform different functions within the culture. It's probably not as stark or significant as it probably was hundreds of years ago, when we relied purely on the social fabric and the social network in a way that we don't really today. Pretty much most people could kind of do any job, but some people they sort of gravitate to it a little bit more than others. But so there's something still there. So okay. So I've talked about that in other videos. Feel free to look those up. But so the commenter, going back to the commenter, I had to do a little aside there, sorry. Going back to the commenter, they asked, well, if this is so important, then why is it so hard for people to identify which type somebody is? And I think even more so, why do we disagree on what type somebody is, right? So if everybody is sort of filling a particular role, then shouldn't and we sort of evolved as a species for people to fill those roles within culture, and then don't you think it would be pretty easy for us to identify them as, as what they are, right? Because to the same extent that we evolved to be these diversified personalities, then shouldn't we have some sort of recognition system in our brain that recognizes, oh, that person is, for lack of a better term, an INFJ, and that person's an ESTJ, and that person's an ISFJ. And we would all sort of agree. And I think, first of all, I think that's a very profound question. um, and it really does sort of speak to, sort of an existential question, like, is this personality type stuff really what we think it is? And I think it is. And here's my best explanation of it, to address that particular question, is I think we do all have the ability to recognize the different roles or the different sort of forms that people take in their personality, the roles that they play, especially as they're older and, sort of developed. But I think it's a very right brain thing. And I think it's what basically Jung was getting at when he talked about the archetypes, right? And, and I'm definitely not the first person to sort of map personality on to Jungian archetypes. I think that was kind of his point in a way, if you really dig into it. And so then and so, those of you who may not be familiar, Jung had this whole idea that in the collective unconscious, there's these representations of different archetypes, the warrior archetype or the mother archetype or the old sage archetype, the mentor, the trickster, various other archetypes, the king, the father, that kind of stuff, which you can look up. And it's roughly 16 archetypes. I mean, you can kind of stretch some of them into mapping on to MBTI types. But to get back to the commenter's question, I think that's what archetypes do, right? And if you think about it, if we, even little kids get this, right? When you watch cartoons or movies sort of directed towards kids, there are these very, very distinct archetypes that the writers are intentionally drawing upon, right? I mean, if I say Yoda, and for, and most of the world is familiar with who Yoda was and the role that he played in that movie's cultural ecosystem, right? The Star Wars ecosystem. Most of us would probably agree that he's the archetype of a mentor, or, or an old sage, sort of a subtype of the mentor archetype. And I think we'd all sort of agree to that, right? I mean, very few of us would probably classify him as something other than that. I mean, maybe a trickster when you first meet him, but ultimately he becomes, I think, pretty, the rock solid mentor, old sage archetype. And I think, Lucas intentionally made him that way. And, you could go through all of the movies, especially movies geared towards kids, like Disney movies and these sort of sci-fi space opera type movies. And you're going to see the different archetypes all over the place, right? And so we all sort of agree, I think, in general, what archetype these different characters play. So there's something there, right? Like even if we've never talked about it, never heard about it, when you see Yoda or Obi-Wan Kenobi or Gandalf or any of these old sage wizard types, Dumbledore, that kind of, the old sage mentor. There's something in our brain that says, I know what that character is, right? Whether or not you can articulate it or not, there's just sort of this sense, right? This sort of this, I guess, for lack of a better word, this feeling that you get when you come across these archetypes. And then it's only when you get older that you start realizing, like, oh, this thing actually has a name, and this is what they are. So it's a very right brain thing to me. And I think to sort of understand where I'm going with this, I have to do a little bit of a sidetrack and talk about right brain versus left brain. And there's lots of very interesting studies out there, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, with split brain patients where their corpus callosum that connects the right brain to the left brain is severed for one reason or another. And so they sort of have these two levels of consciousness, or two parallel consciousnesses working side by side, where the right brain is sort of doing some stuff and the left brain is doing other stuff. And you can test these patients and figure out, okay, what does the right brain do? What does the left brain do? And as we've sort of advanced, we've also, you can put somebody in an MRI machine or hook them up to an ERP machine, and you can tell, okay, what's the right brain doing versus what's the left brain doing. There's even methods where they could just sort of like send electrical shocks or impulses to your head and basically turn off your right brain for a little, for a small amount of time, and then have you try to do a right brain task and you just can't do it. And then when your right brain comes back, then you can do it just fine. So it's one of the more established findings in the neuroscience community. So it's very well accepted that your right brain is doing something different than your left brain. For most people, there's some people where it sort of crosses, but in general, right brain and left brain are doing different things. But the dispute is sort of over, okay, well how exactly do you describe what quote unquote right brain stuff is versus quote unquote left brain stuff? And the best explanation that I've heard is the right brain is sort of doing big picture stuff, what we would call gestalt type of stuff. And the left brain is doing more discrete processing, like logical processing, language, math, where you have to break things into discrete components and then sort of order them in a particular way, right? In the way that you do with language. You have to figure out the syntax, you have to figure out what the words are and the order of the words. Or math, what 2 + 2 = 4, that kind of thing, very sequential, very sort of broken down and analytical. And it's very discrete. It's sort of piece by piece, right? But the right brain is doing more big picture stuff. And so it can contribute to language, but it's contributing more towards what they might call prosody, like, your inflection, the sort of, it's not necessarily the words that you're using, but the way that you inflect your voice. Is it rising? Is it rising like a question, or is it rising, or not rising, staying steady like a statement? And then there's also, sort of picking up on foreign dialects and languages and stuff like that. So there's big picture stuff and there's discrete stuff, analytical stuff. Okay. And to me, the right brain is, the other thing that I should mention is that there's pretty good evidence that your right brain sort of picks up on stuff first. And then your left brain figures out, it sort of interprets what the right brain is sending it, the information that the right brain has picked up, and the left brain sort of explains it, right? And so think of, you walk into a room and immediately you know what type of room you're in. It could be a doctor's office, it could be a mechanic's shop, it could be a circus, it could be a retail store, it could be a liquor store, it could be a movie theater, it could be a live performance theater, lots of different types of rooms you could walk into. And immediately when you walk into it, you have the context, the overall sort of, this is the, type of room I'm in. But your right brain can't articulate it. Okay. So if you take one of these split brain patients and you just show them maybe a picture of a room or something to their right visual field, so they're not getting the information in their left visual field, um, they sort of, you could there's ways that you could tell that they know the type of room or what they're seeing, but they can't articulate it, right? Because they're not sending that information to the language processor that says, oh, okay, this is a theater. And the reason that I know it's a theater is because it's got a bunch of seats and it's got a stage, and it's got a curtain, and it's got lights, and the seats are all facing the stage, and blah, 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 blah. And so the left brain sort of makes up the story, right? It provides an explanation of what's going on in the right brain. But the right brain, quote unquote, knows what it's seeing, but it just can't articulate it. It can act on it in a way that shows you that the right brain knows what it's looking at, but it just can't say it, because it doesn't have the language part, or at least the syntax and semantics that the left brain does. Okay. So it's a very important concept to understand about the brain and the way that the mind works. And it also helps explain a lot of what's going on when you're interacting with different people, because if we all sort of agree that Yoda is this mentor sage archetype, well, we're seeing it and understanding it with our right brain. And if you agree with Jung that there's this sort of, you know, um, collective unconscious where we all sort of know things, from birth, just because our brains were sort of fine-tuned or programmed through evolution or whatever, then that's going to be right brain stuff. And then the left brain just sort of articulates and explains what it thinks is going on. And it's what's involved with analyzing it and breaking it down. Okay. And articulating it to other people. So, what's going on here? With the personality stuff, I think really what's going on is we probably all generally agree on the quote unquote type that somebody is on a right brain wavelength, right? Um, but then what happens is our left brain takes over and starts analyzing it and explaining why we think that person is a such and such, right? Why we think they're an ENTJ or an ENFJ or whatever. Now, our right brain is not categorizing people into ENFJ, INFJ, ESTP, all that kind of stuff. That's left brain stuff. That's analytical stuff. The right brain is just picking up on the fact that that's a certain type of archetype, and I know it when I see it. I can't articulate it. I can't tell you what it is just with my right brain, but I know it when I see it. And so here is maybe the possible thought experiment. Forget about all the letters, forget about all the categories and the names of the types. And if we just took a bunch of people that were all sort of the same personality, the same archetype, but we didn't try to label them. We just said, we took a bunch of people and they're all in different archetypes. Some are the same archetype, some are different archetypes. So there's groupings of them. And then I asked everybody, okay, just sort of group these, and you probably tend to put Julius Caesar and Napoleon and maybe Alexander the Great, those types of people, historical figures, into the same category. And I'm not asking you, are they an ENTJ or an ESTP or anything like that? I'm just saying, try to put everybody into just rough categories that you think are sort of similar to each other, right? And, and there's probably plenty of people that we would put in sort of the mother archetype and people we would put into the warrior archetype and maybe people we put into the trickster archetype. And I would think, I could be wrong about this, but I would think that there's probably going to be a lot of agreement and overlap in our responses. Okay. If we're just thinking about it right brain, okay, not trying to break them down into whether they're an ENTJ or an ESTJ or anything like that. Just put them in groups and if they're similar, put them in the same group. If they're different, put them in a different group and so on and so forth. Okay. Hopefully you understand the thought experiment that I'm making. But it's not until we start trying to explain what we think these types are using our left brain when the communication and the ability to agree starts breaking down. Okay. And it's, to me, I think it's because our left brains have sort of built up different explanations of what these types are. And especially if you get into, trying to break them down by cognitive functions, which is a very analytical left brain type of thing. Um, there's some right brain parts to it too. You kind of know extroverted thinking when you see it, but then your left brain has to take over and explain what differentiates extroverted thinking from all the other functions and what is its sort of core identity. What are the core characteristics of extroverted thinking? And that's when it starts sort of breaking down, because if we disagree on how we explain the different functions in a left brain way, if I say, explain to me what extroverted thinking is, or explain to me what extroverted sensing is, then we start sort of categorizing them differently, right? So, like one example that stands out to mind is, in the socionics model, again, I'm not an expert by any means, but I have watched a few videos. And they tend to put, Napoleon and Julius Caesar and probably Alexander the Great and those, sort of classic general military leader types. They tend to classify them, I think, as ESTPs or at least like SPs, where I would think of them more as ENTJs, because I'm thinking more of I'm sort of explaining, or my left brain is explaining the archetype, right? Because that's what your left brain does, is it explains what's going on in your right brain. And it sort of makes up the story, whether it's true or not. It's going to make up a story so that you can articulate the idea. And my left brain story is reading, I've got the archetype of whatever these guys are, probably, some sort of warrior archetype. But sort of a subclass of warrior or something, and my brain, left brain, sort of explains it as them being ENTJs or maybe ESTJs, because analytically I've sort of pieced together the cognitive functions and the way that I think of them and the way that I explain them in a particular way, right? Where the socionics folks, they see this sort of brash, I'm taking over the world, I'm, sort of accumulating all the goodies, the Pac-Man running around getting all the dots. They see that as very SP, and their left brain explains it in a different way. And so this is what I meant when I was in my conversation with Shane about how we just sort of explain the functions differently. And because we explain the functions differently, we're going to come out with different 4-letter types, right? Or categories. But if, God himself came down and said, well, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Julius Caesar are all the same type, and I call them, a Kiki type. Okay, and we would all say, yeah, we agree. That's exactly what I've been saying all along. But it's just that our left brains have sort of explained the story differently. So on a right brain level, I would argue that we probably agree with, who these different types are. But on a left brain level, we think of the functions maybe differently. Our left brain's telling different stories. It's when I say stories, I mean like breaking down and reading what's happening in the right brain and coming up with a verbal, articulable explanation of what that representation is over there in the right brain. And then we get caught up in sort of overanalyzing it, right? And trying to fit all these pieces together so that what's going on in our right brain makes sense. Okay. And we do this all the time. I mean, outside of personality and categorization and all that stuff. I mean, this is what your brain is constantly doing. It's picking up right brain stuff, and then your left brain is trying to come up with some explanation for what's going on. And 99% of the time we probably agree with each other, but then there's these weird little, phenomena like personality types, that kind of thing, where it's purely dependent on how you describe it. When it comes to sharing information with others. But that's not to say that we necessarily disagree that the types are different. It's just how we describe it. So I hope I'm making my point. If this is confusing, but you're still interested in it, maybe look up, some of the right brain versus left brain stuff so that you get sort of a right brain sense of what I'm talking about, sort of a bigger picture sense. And it might help explain it. And so, so when you see people that are quote unquote mistyped, like I remember that all the rage several years ago was if anybody was claimed to be an INFJ, they were lying on on YouTube, and anybody who had a channel where they claimed to be an INFJ, everybody would swoop in and tell them, "No, you're an ESFP" or something like that. But I think we could probably take all those people and say that they actually do all belong in the same category. It's just not INFJ, or at least the people who didn't think they were INFJs. It's something else. So I think there's that. But then there's also sort of what I would refer to as just sort of analysis or paralysis by analysis, where you can get a little too into the weeds of trying to justify what you think somebody's type is, because again, you get this right brain gestalt image of them, just immediately when you see them, the first few seconds of hearing them or just seeing them, you're gonna get this sense that, oh, this is totally an INTP, or this is totally an ISFJ. And then your left brain takes over and starts justifying what your right brain originally thought, right? And then you just get in the habit of your left brain sort of explaining these different types in particular ways, right? So I might go to one of these websites where they purport, or they try to type, a bunch of celebrities, and for whatever reason, for one reason or another. And I might look at the grouping of the celebrities and say, yeah, they all kind of seem similar to me. They all seem to sort of fit the mold a particular mold of one archetype or another. I just don't think that they're an ISFJ. I think they're an ISTP or whatever. So I think that's part of it. But then also, once the left brain takes over, then it's you're just sort of off to the races. And it's like you're just trying to convince people of your story that you came up with the right brain imagery. And again, we might all, if we are able to articulate what's going in our right brain, we might all agree that these people are whatever our right brain calls them. But it's because the left brain comes in and tries to analyze it and pick it apart. And then we sort of disagree on the analysis or how these things are, supposed to be broken down or picked apart. And then you add another layer of complexity to it, like I mentioned before, where we also have a very right brain conception of the functions. What does it mean to be SE? What does it mean to be SI? And we have this, we all have this, or at least for those of us who have been doing it for a while and have sort of built this sort of right brain representation of when you see somebody and you're like, yeah, that person's got a lot of SE in them. We might all agree that these people have a lot of SE in them, but we disagree with how we describe that or what makes this person have a lot of SE versus somebody else, right? And also, where it falls into the function stack, is it dominant? Is it in the third slot? Is it in the fourth slot? Again, we sort of have this right brain sense of it. They seem to be dominant. They're giving me these dominant introverted intuition vibes, so they must be an INFJ or an INTJ, but they're also giving me these sort of, extroverted feeling vibes, so they must be an INFJ. And that's kind of how we piece it together. But it really is a lot of just you get a vibe and then your left brain takes over and just tries to justify it. So that's another reason that I tend to gravitate towards the talking with famous people model, the defensible typology, because there's at least a fighting chance that you're not just gonna come up with a right brain impression and then have your left brain take over and start justifying it and explaining why your right brain is right. So most typology sessions that I've seen, typing sessions, or just when people try to explain what type somebody is, you could tell that they just started off with a right brain impression. This person's an ENFJ. And then the left brain takes over and just starts explaining why they think they're an ENFJ. And in the defensible typology thing, at least, you're going through each of the functions sort of systematically, and this person either has it or they don't, front stack. And so you might, there's a lot of typing sessions where within the first 20 seconds or something, I think, okay, this person is clearly a ENFJ or something like that. And then they start going through systematically the different functions and say, okay, no, they're not an ENFJ because of, they're not polar on this function or whatever, and now I could see why they're this other type, And so you don't let your right brain just sort of completely run the show and then have your left brain try to explain it. You're actually using your left brain to systematically go through and figure out, okay, what do they have and what don't they? Where I would say in 90% of the other cases, it's just, I'm going to go with my initial impression, and maybe I'll change my mind if you do something, if you sort of go off course in a particular way. I'll change my mind about what I originally thought, but most of the time, I'm going to have an initial impression and my left brain takes over and just tries to explain it. And like we said in our video with Shane, the video with Shane, we both sort of made the comment, yeah, I can come up with, I can come up with an argument for anybody to be any type, right? I mean, I could cherry pick the evidence and say this guy is clearly an ESTJ or this gal is clearly an ISFJ, and cherry pick evidence that fits my quote unquote theory for anybody and for any type. Some might be harder than others, but you could still do it. Your left brain is very good, especially if you're an introverted thinker. Your left brain is very good at coming up with an explanation that sort of justifies your initial thought. I think this person's an INFJ, and here's my laundry list of ideas or reasons why they are. And then it becomes, somebody else comes in and says, no, they're not an INFJ, they're an INFP. And here's my laundry list of reasons, giving you their left brain read on the situation. But we might agree, okay, this person sort of fits this archetype, right? We just sort of disagree with how to explain it using our left brain. Okay. And so that maybe explains some of the differences of the models, or why, there's sort of this breakdown on something that should be very important for every individual of figuring out, okay, what role do these different people play in our culture, and what role do I play in our culture? But maybe it's easier said than done. A lot of right brain stuff is, that's a very, very interesting phenomenon. And this isn't just personality stuff. It happens all over the place. And it explains a lot of what, of sort of the quirkiness of the mind. Other ways of thinking about it, there's thinking fast and slow. What's his name? Wrote that. It's Tversky, and he had this there's this famous duo of psychologists, Tversky and the name will come to me, but the other guy is the one that wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. And that's a good book, and that's kind of along these same lines, where your right brain sort of just comes up with answers real quick, and your left brain sort of slowly and meticulously analyzes it. He doesn't really just do left brain, right brain, but that's just another way to think about it. But and then there's all sorts of phenomenon like political affiliation, why we sort of dig our heels in protecting our, if you're conservative or if you're liberal, protecting your quote unquote team. Because you get a right brain impression, and then your left brain just comes up with rationalizations and explanations, and why people might just sort of ignore what's sort of glaring them in the face, on both sides. But yeah, so it explains a lot. So I'd definitely recommend looking into it. Okay, not seeing any comments, so I'm probably gonna jet. If you're seeing this later, and feel free to drop a comment. Let me know if any of this makes any sense or not. Just sort of loosely piecing together these ideas. Again, very a right brain sort of aha moment with my left brain's trying to articulate it. I would probably argue, lead intuitives are probably very right brained. I think it's a very right brain function. Sort of looking at the whole as opposed to sort of discrete analysis. So yeah. Okay. Drop a comment. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Bye.